Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. My name's Rebecca Arnold, and I am the lecturer in History of Dress here at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And I'm really pleased that so many people could join us today for the launch of Lucy Moyse Ferreira's new book, Danger in the Path of Chic. I'm so excited to have Lucy with us today and to be able to launch this wonderful book with her. It's the second book published as part of the series that I edit for Bloomsbury, which is a joint series between Bloomsbury and the Courtauld Institute called Fashion, Visual and Material Interconnections. I've known Lucy for quite a long time now. She did my MA, she then did my PhD, and this work has gone towards the book. And it's such a brilliant, rich piece of writing focused on the ways in which violence and trauma were represented, expressed, resisted within 1920s and 1930s fashion, but also with a very keen eye to art and film and also literature. So it's a really fantastic topic. It's very rich. It's very much of the moment, even though it's looking at the interwar period. I think there's a lot that is very meaningful and important to our own period. And Lucy has published a lot of really interesting articles relating to her interest in this period and also in relation to beauty. She's also got a chapter on perfume, which is based on her MA dissertation, which was also brilliant, coming out in March in a book called Shopping the Senses. Lucy is now lecturer in fashion, media and digital innovation at the London College of Fashion. And I'm so happy to introduce her. So Lucy, if I could now hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's wonderful to have so many of you in the audience, have so many colleagues and friends and family joining. It's brilliant. And I'd like to start by really thanking everybody who made my book possible. There are so many people who helped me and advised me along the way. The whole team at Bloomsbury were absolutely fantastic. And I met lots of kind people in archives, libraries, museums, people who helped me with picture permissions, which is always very complicated. And those were supported by the Courtauld Fund, which I'm really grateful for. And all of my colleagues have also given me advice along the way as well. And Rebecca, again, I'd really like to thank you. As you mentioned, you've been there for me since my master's degree at the Courtauld, which amazingly enough was over 10 years ago now, which I find hard to believe. It's really flown by, so thank you. And thank you so much also to Catherine and the whole Research Forum team for organising and hosting this book launch event. I'm so thrilled to have published this book, Danger in the Path of Chic, with Bloomsbury and the Courtauld. And it is really special to me, especially because the research I carried out during my PhD at the Courtauld did become the foundation for this book. Severed heads, scalpels, and skeletons aren't really terms typically associated with fashion, much less that of the interwar period. Yet whilst I was conducting archival research for my master's degree back at the Courtauld, those were the types of images that I kept on coming across. So as Rebecca mentioned, my dissertation back then was on the concept of interwar designer perfume. So it's really the first time we start seeing celebrity or designer perfumes. But as I was poring over the fashion magazines, and the Courtauld History of Dress department has an amazing archive that I was always in, I was looking at all of the magazines across the 20s and the 30s. I couldn't help but notice all of these instances of violence. And this was really quite a surprise at first, because I wouldn't previously have associated violence with fashion until maybe in 1970s punk or 1990s hair and chic, for example. And I found that actually in existing literature, it hadn't been mentioned either, sort of going back to the 20s and 30s. And I wondered what factors contributed towards this imagery cropping up so consistently. And this is what really drove me towards pursuing a PhD to try and answer these questions and then publish this book. So in doing so, I found that violence really manifested itself broadly in multiple forms. And I considered many different types of violence. So for example, physical and literal violence, such as the trompe-l'oeil tears, you can see here, are fundamental to Scaparelli's 1938 tear dress, as well as more metaphorical concepts of violence. So for example, including notions of fragmentation, psychological trauma, sexual violence, And this allowed me to examine violence upon, towards, and within the body. I found these examples across multiple media, from fashion magazines, fashion illustration, fashion photography, to beauty advertising and haute couture designs. I noticed that these themes also cropped up within wider culture and society, demonstrating important connections between fashion and its multiple contexts. I therefore took a multidisciplinary approach towards my research, and that's very much reflected in the resulting book. I analysed literature and film, for example, as another means through which tropes of violence and expressions of trauma reached fashionable female audiences. As a result, I contextualised primary fashion objects with sources as diverse as medical manuals, propaganda posters, and this really happens throughout the book and throughout the thesis. And in doing so, I was placing the examples of violence and trauma in fashion within a wider network of visual, material, and documentary representations. Throughout, the themes of modernity, literature, eroticism, art, and the growing discipline of psychoanalysis emerged. They all, in fact, produced their own manifestations of violence, and I found that by connecting them to fashion, I was able to grasp a deeper understanding of both violence in fashion itself, as well as nuances within the society and period it emerged within. My main goal was to uncover why this type of graphic horror was manifesting itself in this way at that time, and in a sphere that's usually perceived as being built on fantasy and escape. I therefore considered the various social, political, and economic contexts as essential elements in pursuing an understanding of the manifestation of violence in fashion at this time. The manifestations of violence in fashion occurred during a period that was consistently marred by violence within wider society on an international level, creating widespread loss and trauma that didn't relent. At the same time, modernity was bringing with it dizzying changes and further instability to be contended with. Fashion wasn't removed from this, far from it, and it played a critical role in mediating, responding, and contributing to this lived experience. As a result, in the book, I identified how the period also saw the establishment of fundamental fashion trends that persist today, including, for example, the colour black becoming officially chic, beauty turning to pseudoscience, and also the popular coining of the term sex appeal in fashion. I focused on British, French, and American fashion, particularly in the cities of London, Paris, and New York. They each served as centres and directors of the international fashion scene. The experiences of modernity and the everyday societal status quo experienced by women in these cities were really important representations of the wider social and cultural changes. Critically, they also served as political allies. Examining episodes such as the aftermath of the First World War, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the build-up to the Second World War in the book were all integral elements in understanding how and why violence and fashion became so conflated and so relevant in this period. In particular, my book questions how these developments implicated and were experienced by women, considering the ways in which fashion represented and contributed to a sense of anxiety. It assesses the extent to which fashion was a source of violence towards women, and how it could also offer a means through which to engage with and actively employ conceptual violence themselves. It tracks how this phenomenon of violence in fashion changed as the interwar period progressed, and how it differed within the various aspects of the fashion industry. In doing so, it illustrates the construction of a new, subversive form of femininity that countered the way in which images of women were used within the mainstream. I structured the book thematically, with each chapter exploring a different form of violence. I'm now going to read an excerpt from towards the end of my second chapter, which focused upon fragmentation. The chapter examines a range of materials that embody the concept of fragmentation and considers how they informed notions of modernity and femininity. It highlights the physical injuries suffered by soldiers returning from the war and how this impacted wider society. Informed by psychoanalysis and fashion illustration, it establishes that there was a new contemporary conception of the division between mind and body. It then went on to explore fragmented and anxiety-filled perceptions of modernity, concentrating on women's place in the city as an emblem for modern life. It interprets a new cultural focus on the eye and its parallels in beauty marketing, in makeup trends, and surrealism alike. Finally, the chapter moved to the mid to the late 1930s, with a return to classicism in fashion design and its implications on national propaganda and art in a section entitled The Classical versus Fragmented Body, which I will now read. The fast-paced modernity that led to the simultaneous progress, anxiety, and fragmentation over the 1920s and into the mid-1930s didn't relent during the latter period of the 1930s. Rather, the economic depression and increasing political instability served to compound anxiety and contribute further to changing attitudes, which continued to be explored through representations of women. In the face of this relentless unease and unsteadiness, a new aesthetic began to gain favour across Europe and America. Ideals of classicism began to permeate society and culture, from political imagery and ideology to fashion, art, and design. They were revealed through a visual language that favoured principles such as balance, proportion, and wholeness, which directly contrasted the instability and fragmentation that had been caused both by the aftermath of the First World War and by developments within modern life. Referring to classicism conjured a sense of order amongst present-day upheaval and could serve as an idealistic antidote to restore fragmentation. These convictions appeared within imagery of the female body. Nevertheless, dissenting forays into fragmentation continued to appear in relation to women, particularly those produced by surrealist artists and Elsa Scaparelli. This led to opposing perceptions of the female figure, classical and whole versus fragmented. New developments within fashion design were one avenue in which this new classical aesthetic manifested itself. Madeleine Vionnet and Madame Rey, for example, favoured classically inspired draping and the bias cut, which involved cutting on the diagonal, following the body's contours and enhancing the drapery. Vionnet's design, for example, her process involved working directly upon the female body itself, requiring really clever and careful consideration and use of fabrics shaped directly onto the living form. She embraced new fabrics and techniques at the forefront of modernity, yet used them in such a way that demonstrated remarkable craftsmanship and remained consciously classical and timeless, as Caroline Evans and Min Thornton have described. The way in which these designs were disseminated furthered this deliberate core classicism, such as the 1933 photograph pictured here. The model's halter-neck dress deftly contours her torso before cascading into flowing lines of fabric, which explicitly related to the straight lines of the column she poses against. With her hair slicked back smoothly, the styling emphasizes the sculptural qualities of the dress, as if she too were carved from stone. These changes in fashion coincided with developments in art. During the 1930s, the sculptor Ferreira studied ancient art in the British Museum, and this interest was strongly reflected in his work. His torso, for example, in 1933, used a simplified form and flowing lines to produce an homage to the torso in Portland stone. Its elegant simplicity and proportions reflected the new cultural tendency to favour classicism, taking inspiration from the natural naked female form, which he studied from life. These ideals were aptly expressed through sculpture and appeared widely throughout the decade. Slightly later, he produced another similar piece. In this case, modern dress was incorporated into his classical aesthetic. The body, although depicted as naked, is slightly idealized, as if it were wearing garments. The natural curve between the waist and hips was smoothed slightly, and the breasts were prominently pushed out. There was less definition of natural features, and the muscle tone and the naturalistic fullness of the thighs, which had all been present within the previous piece, were diminished. It makes sense then that this was in fact commissioned by a corset company, Chanel. Although appearing naked, the piece was cleverly intended to resemble the body as if it was wearing a corset produced by that company. This is also evident in the smoothed facial features and the slicked hair, which recalled current beauty trends, such as dark lips and lacquered hair, which, hardened and set close to the head, in itself evoked statuary. It's evident then that whilst the classical aesthetic suggested naturalness, there was in fact considerable manipulation of the body required in order to achieve it. In March 1934, Dobson was photographed posing with 4 versions of this torso-based sculpture. In this case, the statues each wear a selection of lingerie products produced again by Chanel. While the presence of the statuary torsos within the photograph were a clear reference to classicism, here other factors compete with the usual connotations of tradition, purity, and wholeness. The delimbed nature of the torso is emphasized above wholeness. It seems that purposefully, only enough of the body necessary to display the advertised products remains. The British actress, Jean de Casely, whose father owned Chanel, stands in the center of the statue mannequins alongside their creator. Her appearance, laden in layers of luxurious furs, contrasts the undressed, unliving nature of the mannequins. Nevertheless, there is a similarity in the profile of the faces and the outline of the hair, which suggests that underneath the woman's glamorous appearance, similar garments may have been helping to shape it. In classical imagery, the appearance of the torso usually serves to suggest harmonious ideals. However, here, the body part appears to be more radicalized. Not only does she, in her living, whole form, highlight the statuary torso's uncannily fragmented nature, but they also model the very undergarments that were necessary to mold the female body, including hers, into an accepted form according to convention. The use of smoothing, shaping undergarments, such as those preferred by Chanel, could help to promote control and discipline in the face of uncontrollable adversity. Yet streamlining the body in this way came at the expense of discomfort and constriction beneath the contoured body. Exposing the process in this way ripped off the glossy layer of streamlined fashion and the rigorous process underneath. Discarding the limbs in this way, due to being necessary to the purpose at hand, also suggested a violent, fragmentary attitude towards the body that only deepened as the decade wore on. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini were concurrently using statuary to promote their fascist ideals within propaganda. In a 1935 speech, Hitler declared that each politically historical epoch searches in its art for the link with a period of an equally heroic past. Greeks and Romans suddenly stand. This was particularly evident on the occasion of the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin. Hitler seized this as an opportunity to promote the Nazi Party and heavily used imagery to associate it with ancient Greece, where the Olympic Games had begun. This was reflected by the stadium, the pageantry, even in the official poster selected for the Games. It depicted a golden, wreathed victor outstretching a muscular arm, as if he were an ancient statue. Additionally, Olympic statues were erected in Berlin that were designed to represent the supposedly ideal body, further evoking classicism with their muscular, idealized bodies that were uncompromisingly whole. While Hitler drew upon ancient Greek imagery, Mussolini manipulated the heritage of ancient Rome to promote his own fascist party. He even commissioned an exhibition dedicated to it in September 1937. Here, historical events were juxtaposed with present ones, directly linking ancient Roman victories with present fascist activities. This appropriation of the classical body was also taken up by Salvador Dali in 1936. Amidst the height of the Nazi and fascist adoptions of classicism, he produced his Venus de Milo with drawers. By inserting 5 drawers within this epitome of the classical, balanced, beautiful body, he took the current taste for classicism, which had become a dominant force in art, fashion, and even politics, and disrupted and interrupted it. He deliberately toyed with and mocked these contemporary usages of classical values, for example, through the 6 pom-poms that adorn the head in each drawer. This adds a level of shock and the absurd. Moreover, they also express sensuality with their tactile material, playing up to Venus's status as the goddess of love, and also invoke texture and dress. Venus's depicted dress, carefully draped around her lower half, was similar to the kinds of materials that present-day women were fashionably wearing upon their bodies. Not only, then, did Dali mock and highlight the cynicism that existed behind many modern references to classical imagery, but he also further related it to femininity and incorporated dress. It's perhaps unsurprising, then, that he would go on to collaborate so successfully with Elsa Scaparelli, or that their joint work would go on to explore these boundaries. At around the same time, the pair incorporated these ideas within Scaparelli's boutique, Scap, which had opened shortly beforehand in 1935. They dyed an oversized bear in Scaparelli's signature shocking pink, which brought vivid colour dissonance and the violent visionary effects that were brought with it, which I do discuss earlier in the book. Dali carved drawers within the bear's stomach, which were used to display jewellery, brutally cutting the body open and dividing its stomach into removable fragments. While the body was an animal's, it was placed within the female realm of a fashion boutique, which itself was female-owned, and this association of femininity is reinforced by the use of Scaparelli's shocking pink. This dramatic act of fragmentation also had psychological implications. Drawing on classicism, as well as contemporary psychoanalysis, Dali stated that the only difference between the immortal Greece and contemporary times is Sigmund Freud, who discovered that the human body, purely Platonic at the Greece epoch, nowadays is full of secret drawers that only psychoanalysis is capable of opening. The anthropomorphic bear, then, signified the depth and variety of layers within the human mind that psychoanalysis could unravel. In the context of Scaparelli's boutique, the fragmented bear come chest of drawers suggested that fashion too could unlock and display aspects of the self. The duo would take this one stage further, directly into dress design itself, and in 1936 produced a women's skirt suits and coats that also had drawers in the form of horizontal pockets with metal drawer handles. It was pictured in September edition of Vogue that year, with a photograph by Cecil Beaton of 2 models wearing the suits, as you can see. The caption described that famous surrealist Salvador Dali inspired Scaparelli to put pockets like bureau drawers on her suits, and the feature included a study by Dali for his 1936 painting, Anthropomorphic Cabinet. While contemporary manifestations of the classical body constructed a sense of wholeness, Dali and Scaparelli's fragmentation of it through drawers exposed the superficiality of this. While they may appear wholesome, this was superficial and really based on considerable constriction and manipulation, both of facts, for example, in Mussolini's conveniently edited version of Roman history, to the physical contortion of the body required to achieve pure ideal lines of the classical body, as revealed by Dobson. Dali and Scaparelli therefore interrupted and exposed this process through fragmentation. The drawers represented the idiosyncrasies and intricacies of the human mind itself, which could be opened through psychoanalysis, as Dali himself expressed. This role is altered when applied to fashionable clothing, published in a women's fashion magazine. Vogue described the drawer pockets more lightheartedly as individual, imaginative quirks with a touch of surrealism. Moreover, when worn upon the real body of a woman, the drawer pockets take on further meaning. Indeed, while some of the drawer pockets did function as pockets and could contain personal items in the role of a drawer, others were false and merely decorative. This suggested an element of control. Only the female wearer would know which were the real drawers and what they contained. Similarly, Scaparelli's bureau drawers coat, with a similar mix of functioning and decorative-only pockets, bestowed its wearer with a similar sense of control. The coat enclosed her body with a shielding cocoon, covering her from chin to wrist and past the knee. She was presented as a woman with her own personal and complex facets, which she alone could control whether to keep locked or exposed. It's a coat that could be slipped over any outfit to create a personal form of armor. This accords with Palmer White's reading of Scaparelli's daywear, which he described as hard chic, with a militant, masculine quality and a hard, highly individual femininity that would protect the new woman from counterattacks by the male. However, this psychological and physical, considering the garment's enveloping of the body, sense of comfort, didn't negate the inherent violence necessary within the concept of fragmenting the physical body. The violent viscerality of this concept is particularly well represented by Hans Bellmer's dolls, produced around the same time between approximately 1933 and 1937. A series of sculptures and photographs that feature the violent dismemberment and rearranging of a female mannequin or doll, leaving them as a mere sum of body parts. The production of the first doll coincided with the year in which Hitler first rose to power in Germany, which has been read by art historians as an intentional protest. Bellmer himself stated that, if the origin of my work is scandalous, it's because for me, the world is a scandal. Such explicit fragmentation of the female form can indeed be interpreted as a violent protest towards extreme politics by breaking down the apparent wholeness and purity that they perpetuated through classicism. Other critics have interpreted the dolls as a literal embodiment of the Freudian concept of castration. However, the near total fragmentation of the female body also makes an important statement in regards to Dali and Scaparelli's concurrent explorations of the subject in the context of the modern experience. Indeed, as Hal Foster has written, in his erotic manipulation of the dolls, Bellmer explores a destructive impulse that's also self-destructive. Rather than representing a male fantasy or a sexual corruption of a childhood emblem, the dolls can be seen instead to represent the subject himself or herself. Ruth Ronan has argued that the horror and the threat of disintegration that the doll embodies is the most desired state, a source of immense attraction, since it marks the return of the subject to the state that eludes the safe outlines of the self, where subject and external objects are undifferentiated. Rather than being mere objects of sadism, the dolls instead become objects of identification. This accords with Lacan's view on masochism. Lacan wrote, "The position of the perverse masochist is the desire to reduce himself to this nothing that is good, to this thing that is treated like an object, to this slave whom one trades back and forth, with whom one shares." They express then the ultimate end of fragmentation, nothingness. In this way, as Rosalind Krauss has argued, the doll imagery produces the images of what one fears in order to protect oneself from what one fears. And she says, this is the strategic achievement of anxiety, which arms the subject in advance against the onslaught of trauma, the blow that takes one by surprise. While initially fragmentation of the female form is easily interpreted as a violent attack, it also serves then as another form of psychological protection. The subject is in fact safe when reduced to nothing in Lacanian terms, the state of inertia at the beginning of life before pain is perceived. Instead, it's the spectator that takes on the horror and the anxiety of the image. This further contributes towards Dali and Scaparelli's draws within the female body. While they present considerable fragmentation, they also serve to safeguard the wearer, leaving only the onlooker to be affected. This physical fragmentation of the female form continued to pervade surrealist art, and Roland Penrose's Real Woman, 1937, for example, featured the same disfigured, fragmented torso that Belmer reduced many of his dolls to. In the same year, Scaparelli presented her own direct and explicitly violent exploration of the theme with her fifth perfume bottle, Shocking. It represented a sharp change from her previous models, which had followed more traditional formats, such as the simple spherical bottle with a pearlized stopper for her S in 1928. In the case of Shocking, however, its title was an accurate description of its bottle. It took the form of a naked, fragmented female torso. While a fleshy, voluptuous shape contrasted by cold, hard material is a description applicable to an artificial mannequin, classical sculpture, or the Shocking bottle alike, Scaparelli's version represented an abrupt, violent deconstruction of the female form. She deliberately and uncannily signified an overflowing vitality bursting out through constructing the bottle stop as a wreath of flowers. This also signified a clear link to concurrent surrealist endeavours by juxtaposing traditional references and creating new meanings, which also separated her torso from mainstream endeavours and injected violence. This was increased in usage. Lifting off the flowered lid to apply the perfume exposes a cut-off neck, rendering it to be ghastly. As Elizabeth Wilson has stated, fashion always hides a wound. Scaparelli inverted these terms by forcing users to continually carry out the act of beheading the dummy and expose what would be, if it were real, a gaping wound. By revealing this horror, she invoked similar shock tactics to the surrealists. Not only did this separate her work from the status quo, which promoted rationality through the classical whole body, but by carrying out the acts themselves in a masochistic manner, they could be protected from any sadist onlooker and reflect the anxiety back onto them. In Scaparelli's case, this could be carried out literally. Her customers sprayed the scent directly onto their own bodies, which enveloped them in a protective cocoon, much like her bureau drawer designs. The perfume, a traditionally glamorous and feminine object, also acts as an invisible celebration of feminine vitality. This is represented by the flowers erupting from the top of the bottle. And this really surrounds the wound that would be where the neck is missing. This sense of unrelenting life and vigour further served to oppose the cold, hard, and calculated appropriations of the classical body in mainstream imagery. This sense of life and viscerality was again evident in several concurrent surrealist works, such as Marcel Jean's Horoscope, also 1937, a dressmaker's dummy painted with an elaborate, colourful ribcage, effectively transforming it into a fragmented torso with the inner body bursting out. This surrealist stance on fragmentation, which often used the emblem of a torso, even became reflected within more mainstream outlets. The violence of these explorations and their significance to human drives did go on to influence the commercial world, within which a surrealist aesthetic became popular during the mid to later years of the decade. In 1938, for example, Harper's Bazaar used the repeated shape of the torso as a bold cover design. Not only was the torso itself delimbed, but an abstract black and white pattern across each one made the very torsos appear to be fragmented and in pieces themselves. A single cropped eye appeared in the middle of this configuration. It depicted more than simply a reader's observation of the coming fashions, as the headline declared, but also emphasized the way in which fragmented modernity was experienced visually. while the mainstream response was to combat this with a revival of classicism and to favour balance and proportion, violence and fragmentation prevailed, as powerfully demonstrated by surrealist activity, including Scaparelli's fashion output. Whether knowingly or not, Harper's Bazaar's striking cover boldly depicted this very process. These considerations began to affect the portrayal of and attitudes towards real bodies. In August 1938, British Vogue published an article entitled "The Slender Truth," comprised of slimming advice. This exemplified the control and discipline of the body advocated by contemporaneous strivings towards balance and classicism. The article detailed 5 different methods: dieting, exercise, massage, wax baths, and sweating and corseting. This reveals the effort, and in some cases even pain, necessary behind achieving the favoured fashionable appearance. The article even mentioned certain kinds of exercises as being violent and warned it may strain your heart. It demonstrated the way in which dress was perceived as having a crucial role in attaining the idealized classic form. They said, "A good corset can work wonders in the way of molding and controlling too lavish curves. It's firm, solid truth," explained the article. Yet there was little truth if such molding and controlling of the body was required. Perhaps most representative of the piece's values, however, is the full-page photograph that accompanied it. Shot in black and white with soft light, it depicted another naked female torso, with linen cascading from her arm, invoking classicism once more. Her limbs were again severed explicitly, with only stumps of the arms and neck remaining, and the legs cropped out of shot. Viewed in isolation, it could be an artistic, classical interpretation. Viewed alongside the accompanying article on the opposite page, though, the way in which they were intended to be displayed, it had disturbing consequences. It suggested that, like the grotesque dismemberment in the photograph, the body can be vastly manipulated, even if this involved violent means. These ideas had already been grappled with in art, film, and photography. In particular, Jean Cocteau's avant-garde film, Le Sang d'un Poète, 1930, connected violence, fragmentation, and femininity. Here, model, artist, and muse Lee Miller was transformed into a classical white statue, her fragmented arms ending in explicit stumps. In the film, the statue initially appeared as a mere object, but it was given life and anthropomorphized when the male protagonist, an artist, placed a sketch of fragmented lips over the mouth. Throughout the film, various images of fragmentation, such as the spinning human head constructed from wire, appear. However, one scene particularly links the protection of Lacanian masochism and disintegration, and it really exemplifies Lacan's mirror stage. A solitary arm appears and hands the artist a gun. With a spinning wire head behind him, he shoots his own head. However, instead of dying, the fragmented head again appears in isolation, followed by a solitary mirror which fills the frame. The still living artist bursts from it. Then, in an act of aggression, he proceeds to smash the statuary Miller with a mallet, chipping away at her stone body until it lies in pieces on the floor. As with Belmer's dolls, fragmentation is carried out to its fullest extent, to total obliteration. The presence of the mirror recalls its function in Lacan's mirror stage, to symbolize the act of uniting the fragmented body upon a superficial, image-based plane. Reducing the statue Lee Miller to pieces, which recedes her to a state of inertia before the realization of the mirror stage, where pain is not perceived. Instead, the artist who inflicted this ultimate act of fragmentation and the viewers are themselves the receptors of the horror. As the 1930s progressed, these values seeped into and influenced commercial fashion and the ideology it represented and disseminated. Violence towards and manipulation of the body became more and more explicit within mainstream media as the decade drew to a close, and the threat of a Second World War became clear. In 1938, for example, Vogue published an illustration by Edouard Benito, depicting an evening gown by Chanel and also by Scaparelli. The setting was indicated by a tower in the background as being the prestigious and fashionable Place Vendôme. However, it had been isolated from the city and instead transformed into a barren, oniric background. The model wearing Chanel faces the viewer, while Scaparelli's model faces into the distance, allowing a front and back view, similar to traditional fashion plates. However, neither of the models had heads attached to their body, and instead their necks ended up in amputated stumps, and they raised a floating, severed head up in the air with their arms. This pose recalled the classical imagery of the 1936 Olympics, as if they were victors holding their prize. But instead, Benito subverted this association and presented a sinister version where heads became removable accessories. Indeed, an additional head lay alone on the ground, cast in shadow, as if it were redundant and had been tossed aside. Furthermore, in 1939, the fashion journal Pinpoints published a large, vivid image, which I came across in the Courtauld History of Dress magazine archive. Its black line drawing upon a stark yellow background immediately conjures the violence of vision that was discussed within the first chapter of my book. Yet there was also explicit violence imbued throughout the subject matter. It echoed Scaparelli's shocking with the presence of the limbless torso in the form of a dressmaker's dummy. Yet here, the severed limbs are present, and despite being markedly unattached to the body, the fragmented arms raised above the neck, as though they were still attached. In addition, the doll also seems to have a head held between the floating arms, which appear to be in the process of coolly and detachedly interchanging it. A further head rests upon the chair, with eyes peacefully closed upon each of the faces. They're presented as interchangeable accessories of the body. The doctrines of a malleable body, strictly molded to meet the confines of modernity, culminated in this violent manipulation decidedly linked to fashion, which was a perpetrator of many of these demands. Its surrealistic references provide a shock tactic to momentarily distract the beholder from everyday reality and to perhaps ponder the absurdity of some of its demands. Despite the wide onset of classism throughout politics, art, and fashion during the 1930s, violence and fragmentation prevailed in response to rapid and unsettling changes. After the war, reunion and wholeness was striven for on a macrocosmic level and continued to be perpetuated by governmental propaganda and mainstream media, and they turned to wholesome and classical tropes in order to promote this, which often featured manipulation of the female form. However, tension and anxiety remained, and this was further compounded by the bombardment of modernity, particularly in the city. This was counteracted by avant-garde artists, Scaparelli, and certain fashion publications through the use of fragmentation, which disrupted, interrupted, and broke down the classical body. They resisted and fought against superficial wholeness and instead bolstered fragmentation, which was carried out to various extremes upon the body. This offered various means of protection, comfort, and rebellion for women, from the figurative annihilation of possible pain in certain surrealist images to the empowering gaze that multiple makeup styles provided upon the face itself. As the threat of a second conflict became ever more ominous, the shock tactics used to prove the point increased alongside it. This also marked a rebellion against strongly right-wing ideals, such as fascism, which also took on classicized tropes to serve their own purposes. During the 1930s, therefore, classicism and wholeness versus surrealism and fragmentation emerged as two intertwining yet opposing threads each responding to the onset of a harsh modernity and reality. The female body was a crucial battleground upon which these tensions were played out. And that's the end of my reading. Thank you so much for listening.
Hello, thank you so much, Lucy. That was just fantastic. It was really wonderful to have you talk about how you came upon this subject, and then how it kind of developed and progressed, and then to hear you reading from your chapter, because it's so fascinating how you're showing the different ways that violence can manifest and the ways that trauma can manifest, but also the kind of relationship between the artist, the designer, the wearer, the viewer. It's so complex and it's so interesting. So thank you very much. We've got quite a few lovely questions. Thank you. So please keep dropping them into the chat, everybody, and I will ask as many as I can. So I'm going to dip straight in. I was tempted to ask something myself, but I think I should give everyone else a chance. So Eva Jane says, did women buying these fashions understand the psychological elements of violence behind them, or only purchase a garment because they liked the way it looked on them when they wore it?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. I think there's an element of both sides going on here. I think, you know, on one hand, and unfortunately, given the time period, I haven't been able to speak to people living during this time, but I would imagine that there is a sense of this kind of comfort and armor. So for example, if you're buying a dress that sort of covers you up from head to toe and it's made of a thick fabric, you get sort of physical protection against the elements, against the cold and wind, and also, you know, protection from the male gaze. That could be quite comforting and empowering. And also some designs, they're more on the haute couture side, but for example, Scaparelli's tear dress, her skeleton dress, and I've looked at other examples in my book too, they were sort of a little bit more outlandishly violent. I think nobody could deny that a skeleton dress is sort of quite violent and would have a psychological function. So I think they're kind of two different extremes, but I think even on an everyday level, there'd be some sense of sort of psychological comfort. There was so much going on at the time, especially for women. I mean, in the 20s, you have sort of sudden rising of hemlines and you're exposing more skin than you've ever exposed before. You're sort of chopping your hair into a bob and wearing more makeup than you ever had done. So I think there is this sense of kind of being very much on display, kind of coping with all of these changes. So I think the fashion that came in the 1930s was quite a nice psychological antidote towards that. And I would imagine that that was felt.
Yes, it's really interesting. As you say, it's like different types of fashion, different types of consumers, and someone consciously choosing to shop at Scaparelli is already making a statement and decision, and perhaps more awareness than someone buying a Scaparelli perfume, for example, who might just buy it because she likes it and she likes the smell, but then subconsciously it might be working in other ways. That's really interesting. Oh, someone asked if this was the year Diana Vreeland joined Harper's Bazaar. I think that was in relation to that 1936 cover with the tortoise. I think that is the year.
That is the very year that she joined Harper's. So yeah, really pertinent comment.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it, to see
how it impacts.
She's connected to these editorials. Sorry, that was Bridget, I should have said, who said.
Thanks, Bridget.
And then Jane says, did violence and fragmentation extend to the depiction of men's fashions as well?
So I didn't study menswear for this book, but from what I have seen, it was sort of more of a female thing. It was more about female fashion. I mean, at the time, men's fashion wasn't so differentiated. It was sort of based on a lot of suits and kind of simpler designs, as we know now, ever since the Great Masculine Renunciation. So I think, although there were some fabulous menswear designs, I would say that these themes really did emerge within women's wear primarily because it was really interconnected with women's own experiences and kind of navigating this really turbulent period.
It's interesting. Oh, and she also says, which is really interesting, that the pinpoints illustration that you showed, which was the one with the woman trying her head on almost, she says that it reminds her of Claire Partington's work, which is ceramics with exchangeable heads. I think I've seen something she did where maybe you can see inside the ceramic figure's belly. I think that's the same person.
Oh, amazing. Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much for that.
Yes, I have
Jane,
to
thank
look
you for
her
that.
up.
Yeah, that sounds super relevant.
So interesting. Right. Megan says, I wonder why classicism was so associated with wholeness when much material culture from the classical period is itself fragmented, broken, or damaged in some way.
Thank you, Megan. Another great question. I think it's sort of easy when we're looking at these items in a museum or gallery, we see them how they are now a long, long time later. But of course, at the time, they were very much based on principles of wholeness. So it wouldn't have been seen that way at the time. So I think there is kind of a different lens that we're viewing now in the modern day. So it's interesting, this connection between classicism and wholeness. But I think it is just an unfortunate consequence of kind of history and time.
That's really interesting. And Maria says she loved hearing how it was developed and structured, and that was really great to hear that. Do you want to just quickly say what each chapter covers, because that might be useful for people.
Sure. Thank you so much, Maria. That's so kind of you. Yes, I based it, so each chapter was a different type of violence. So the first one was looking at assault, kind of physical, literal violence. So really looking at the aftermath of the First World War, looking at that huge impact. It was the worst wartime period ever faced by the world at that point, and looking at how that infiltrated into society, returning soldiers and sort of their families and wider society as well. And sort of going through the period, so each chapter covers the entire interwar period, looking at sort of different events in more detail, sort of where they fit in and where they're more relevant. So that was sort of assault and physical violence. And my second chapter was fragmentation, which you heard part of today. And then I went on to look at sexual violence and eroticism. And then my last chapter was looking at sort of deathliness and absence.
Thank you. That's really good to hear that. Let me just go back and look. There's so many good ones. Bridget says that your talk reminds her of McQueen and Chanel.
Oh, thank you. That's a fabulous comment.
Really interesting. Erin says, thank you, Lucy. I can't wait for the book to come out. I have noticed that most magazine images / film materials deal with the fragmented white body. Have you explored how this violence extends to black bodies in the period you were focused on?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. That's something I'm really interested in expanding and exploring. There's so many new angles and avenues I'd like to take this. I mean, I must admit, unfortunately, so back then it wasn't sort of as diverse and there wasn't as much representation as there should be. I mean, that's still the case now, that's getting better very slowly. But that's something that didn't crop up so much in my research, but I'd be really interested to look at this, and perhaps even in the contemporary or sort of later periods. I think this is such a crucial idea. So it's something I would love to look at in later work. Thank you.
I hope that there'll be more access to Black magazines and newspapers. I recently used a database of Black newspapers, which was fantastic, and it was so interesting to see the ways that fashions were depicted. But I think what you were looking at was kind of a white elite fashion press, wasn't it? And it would, as you say, it would be so important and good to look more widely and look at different representations of different of different women and in different contexts.
Absolutely. I mean, I did come across sort of images of Black women sort of dressed in fashionable outfits, but it wasn't so much the kind of conceptual ideas of violence that appeared in couture.
And interesting that it was appearing in couture. Sophie says, a lot of women made their own clothes. Did this allow easy access to materials, i.e. tweed clothes were made at home to last? So do you think there's a difference? Do you think this was going into homemade clothing, or is it more at the representational level and couture level?
I think on the whole, it was more at the representational and couture level. And as Rebecca explained, I was sort of focusing on the elite sort of fashion and art worlds. That's not to say there wasn't sort of influence. Of course, fashion does trickle down. So even if you're looking at these designs just in your magazines or flicking through Vogue, it might give some inspiration. So some of these trends, they wouldn't be so much represented in other classes in society, but actually you do get some simplifications of them. So for example, I look at in chapter 3 on eroticism, I look at sort of how the dresses that were fashionable were really kind of clinging to the body, kind of really revealing all the different sort of folds and forms of the body. And that, for example, I can read it in a sort of psychological way, which I did in my book, but at the same time, a woman might see a picture and sort of be influenced. So maybe not sort of consciously thinking about the violent or psychological impacts, but there was sort of this translation of the wider styles. And for example, this idea of Scaparelli and hard chic, sort of really covering up the female form and giving that sense of sort of armor and empowerment. Again, that's something that could be replicated in tweed, for example.
That's really interesting. Maria says, do you think this fragmentation was also the start of the contemporary marketing of fashion beauty products as separate products, opening the marketplace to a wider range of women who could not achieve or afford the holistically whole idea of fashion from the 1930s?
Yeah, totally. I think this was really, you're quite right, Maria. This is kind of the period that started to happen. I think in my other publication that Rebecca mentioned that's coming out in March in Shopping and the Senses, I talk about it was the 1920s and 1930s that we did get this idea of designer perfume, and then sort of following on from that, beauty products. So it is a way that was more accessible for women to sort of buy into these brands. And I think a lot of the things that we think of as being kind of really foundational in the beauty industry today, they actually did start off in the interwar period. So I think it very much is when these products sort of became separated and it became something aspirational, but a little bit more affordable at the same time. Absolutely.
Fantastic, so interesting. Oh, Susanna has very kindly made a connection to something in the V&A collection. She says that the pinpoints illustration is similar to a 1936 Herbert List photograph in the V&A called Schneiderpuppen, Female Slave 1, and she says she'll send it to you. So that would be really fantastic to see, wouldn't it?
That's fantastic, thank you.
Mitsuyo says, thank you very much. She says, in relation to Belma, she once read that he raised the questions through disturbing shaped dolls that flexible articulations mean flexible thoughts. And that's a lovely idea. Directly connected head and heart equals science and art, etc. And finally, avoid the transformation of human beings to passive dolls. What do you think about that point of view?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, there are so many different interpretations of Belma. I mean, looking through the kind of the classical art historical tombs, there are many different ways of reading it. But I think that's a really interesting one. I haven't come across this already. So this idea of flexible articulations and flexible thoughts. I mean, yeah, fantastic. And this idea of transformation and how that can be avoided is really important. And you're also picking up on the idea of the human beings versus sort of passive dolls, which is really uncanny. So yeah, that's a really interesting point of view. I'll definitely think further on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, isn't it? Bridget says thank you, and she's sure she'll see you in a future issue of Vogue, which is fantastic. We're going to need to draw up to a close, so I just want to quickly see what else. Someone's asked about whether the ideas of violence were contained in Vogue patterns in the 30s as well. I think you've sort of alluded to that, haven't you?
Yeah, I think, yeah, as I said before, sort of translated on a more holistic level, a bit more subtle, but some of the major developments we could see reflected, yeah.
And then someone said, we'll make this the last one, could you just describe what's being torn in the Scaparelli tear dress?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. Really good question. So it was all happening in the material itself. So it was a trompe-l'oeil pattern, kind of fooling the eye. So it looked like bits of the dress were sort of tearing down, torn off, and actually it's sort of pinkish underneath. So it looks like it's almost flesh that's bursting out. So as if the wearer had been sort of attacked or ravaged in some way. Again, so different dress historians have slightly interpreted it differently, but I think it is very much the dress itself that's appearing to be torn, but it's not actually torn. So again, it's that form of empowerment, because you might think, uh-oh, she's got bits of her naked body are being revealed, but actually it's all concealed. It's just kind of playing with the viewer and the onlooker, and again, kind of subverting the male gaze.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm going to stop there because we're at our time limit, but I want to say thank you so much, Lucy. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to everybody who attended and for all your lovely comments and questions, which we'll make sure we pass on to Lucy. And just to end by saying we have more events coming up. We have sold out, unfortunately, but there is a waiting list for Alex Means Fashion Illustration Masterclass on the 24th of January. Then the 28th of January, wonderful Nadia Wang is going to talk about a Singaporean photographer and fashion the body, which will be fantastic. And then Lucy, maybe to end on, you could tell everyone about the conference that I'm organizing with you. It's mainly your idea, on the 6th and 7th of May, because I'm so looking forward to working with you on that, and to hopefully everyone can attend that as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, we're really excited. We're doing a conference that is based on kind of the psychological aspects of fashion and trauma. So it's sort of taking this book theme, but really, really expanding it across different periods, different types of people, different countries. So really looking at that relationship between fashion and trauma on a much wider scale. So thinking about, everything that we've been through as a society in the past couple of years and how that's affected us psychologically, how it's affected our dress, but also how these huge sort of cultural and societal events that happen throughout history, how that does kind of impact the people living through it, and how fashion really reflects that and engages with it. So the title of our conference is going to be Unraveling Threads, Tracing and Transforming Violence and Trauma Through Fashion. And we've got some great speakers, a really good mix of academic speakers, a psychologist, some fantastic industry practitioners. So we're going to get lots of different ideas and approaches, kind of looking at that relationship between fashion and violence and trauma on a much wider scale.
Thank you. Yes, we're very excited about putting it together, and we hope you'll join us for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a lovely week, everyone, and we hope to see you at future Courtauld Institute events. Thank you.
Thank you.